Well, hello, beautiful people of planet Earth. It's 5:03 p.m. on the 27th of September 2024. It's almost Shabbat. The sun's starting to get very low in the sky. So to my Jewish family, friends and community out there in the world, Shabbat Shalom. In honour of the impending Jewish New Year on the evening of the 2nd of October, I thought I would read you some stories from the great works of Jewish fantasy. I'm quite tired and I've been trying to upload my YouTube video of even date, my journal entries all day, and that's not happening and in a far out way, and I kind of know why. It's censorship issues very likely, so I may not be able to upload this one if they put me on some kind of a strike, which they sometimes do. It is what it is, people of Earth. So, but anyway, I've been in bed and had a little lie down. It was bitterly cold with the rain that we received today. The temperature dropped and I've got quite tired, and I actually worried about getting sick too, because with the sudden changes in temperature. So I went and laid down. It was so cold in my bed I actually had to put the electric blanket on. So I laid down for a while and then I got up and I made something to eat, and I contemplated cleaning my fish pond filter, which should have been done today, but it rained, so I'll have to do that tomorrow if it's not raining. And a few other little odd jobs I've got to do, and I'm trying to work out if I'm going to go dancing tonight, as is my usual habit, because I'm a bit tired today. I might actually consider staying home tonight, which is unusual for me. I normally push myself out even if I'm feeling a bit tired. I'm just going to pick stories at random, like there's no particular method in my madness. Here's one that looks like it might be interesting, by Y.L. Peretz. Let's just see how long it is. Sometimes if they're really long stories, we don't want to get trapped in that, because it can take me hours and hours and hours and several videos to plow through. And as you can see, this is a very thick book, so I probably won't be reading you every story in it, but yeah, this is a nod to my my Jewish roots. My Jewish neshama craves some Yiddishkeit for a change. And because it's fantasy stories, this will serve two passions at the same time: my love of Judaism and my love of the supernatural and the paranormal. So here we go, babies. Are you ready? Yes, you are. And if you're not, don't forget to press the red off switch or the X button or whatever turns your computer off. Three Gifts by Y.L. Peretz. Number 1, By the Scales. Once, generations and years ago, a Jew passed away. Well, a Jew passed away. You can't live forever. And he was given his due, a decent Jewish burial. The grave was closed. The bereft son spoke the prayer for the dead, which is called Kaddish. The soul flew up to judgment, the celestial court. When he arrived, the scales were already hanging before the court to weigh the good deeds and the bad. The dead man's defender came, his former good spirit, and stood with a snow-white sack in his hands to the right of the scales. The dead man's accuser came, his former bad spirit, his seducer, and stood with a filthy sack in his hands to the left of the scales. The snow-white sack contained the good deeds, the filthy sack, the bad deeds. The defender poured out the good deeds on the right-hand scale. They wafted like perfumes and sparkled like the stars in the sky. The accuser poured out the bad deeds on the left-hand scale. They were, may you be spared, coal black and stank like pitch and tar. The poor soul stood and gazed and gaped. He had never imagined there was such a difference between good and bad. Down below he had often been unable to tell them apart, mistaking one for the other. And the scales rose slowly, up and down. Now one pan, now the other, and the pointer trembled in the air, shifted a hair's breadth to the left and a hair's breadth to the right. Only a hair's breadth, but not all at once. He had been a simple Jew, with no great crimes nor any martyrdom, and thus tiny virtues, teensy peccadilloes, bits and pieces, specks of dust, some barely visible to the naked eye. But still, when the pointer shifted a hair's breadth to the right, the higher worlds resounded with joy and pride. When it shifted to the left, heaven forbid, a sigh of melancholy passed through the air, all the way up to the throne of God. And the angels poured slowly with devotion, bit by bit, speck by speck, blinding me in the eye. Ah, that's better. Dear God, it really hurts. My eyes are very light sensitive, always have been, even when I was a child. The way simple people at a charity auction bid penny by penny. But every well runs dry. The sacks were empty. Are you through already? Asked the court attendant, a very busy angel. The good spirit and the bad spirit turned their sacks upside down. That was all. The attendant went over to the pointer to see where it had stopped, right or left. He peered and saw something that had never happened since the creation of the heavens and the earth. What's taking so long? Asked the presiding judge. The attendant stammered, It's even. The pointer is right in the centre. The good deeds and the bad deeds are perfectly balanced. And it's getting mightily hot in here. Mightily hot in here. Oh, poor Mama T. Poor Mama T. Wow. Perfectly balanced, they asked, at the celestial bench. The attendant peered again and replied, On the dot. The celestial court deliberated and then issued the following verdict. Since the sins do not outweigh the virtues, the soul shall not go to hell. On the other hand, the virtues do not outweigh the sins, and so we cannot open the gates of heaven for him. Hence, he shall be a vagabond. He shall fly about in the middle, between heaven and earth, until God remembers and takes pity and summons him with his grace. And the attendant took the soul and let him out. The poor soul bewept and bewailed his fate. "Why are you crying?" asked the attendant. "You won't enjoy the delights of paradise, but you won't know the pains and torments of hell. You're even." But the soul couldn't be comforted. The worst torments are better than nothing. Nothing is awful. The attendant felt sorry for the soul and gave him some advice. "Fly down, little soul, and hover about the living world. Don't ever look at the sky. What will you see? Only stars, and they're bright but cold creatures. They have no sense of pity. They won't do a thing for you. They'll never remind God of you. The only ones who can intercede for a poor homeless soul are the saints in paradise. And they, my little soul, they like presents, lovely gifts. That," he added bitterly, "is what saints are like nowadays." "So fly, my little soul," he went on. "Hover low around the living earth and watch life. Watch what happens. And if you see anything of extraordinary beauty and goodness, grab it and fly up. It will be a gift for the saints in heaven. And with that gift in your hand, knock and announce yourself in my name to the angel at the window. Tell him I said it was all right. And once you've brought them 3 presents, you can be sure that the gates of paradise will open for you. The gifts will do the trick. At the throne of honour, they don't like the highborn. They prefer those who make it on their own." And with these words, he mercifully pushed the soul out of heaven. Chapter 2. The first gift. The poor soul flew low, hovering around the living earth, seeking presents for the saints in paradise. He flew and flew over villages and cities, wherever Jews could be found. Through burning rays in the worst heat spells, through raindrops in wet seasons, through silver gossamer that drifted in late summer and snows that fell in winter. He looked and looked, and he looked his eyes out. Whenever he sighted a Jew, he hastily flew down and stared into his eyes. Was he about to sacrifice himself for God? Wherever a light seeped through a crack in a shutter at night, the soul was there. Were God's fragrant blossoms growing in the quiet house, secret good deeds? Alas, usually the soul sprang away from eyes and windows, terrified and trembling. And as the seasons and years wore on, he was stricken with melancholy. Towns had already become graveyards. Graveyards had already been ploughed up as fields. Forests had been cleared. Stones near water had turned into sand. Rivers had changed their courses. Thousands of stars had fallen. Millions of souls had flown upward, and the good Lord did not remember this one soul. And the soul found nothing of extraordinary beauty and goodness. He thought to himself, the world is so wretched, people are so mediocre, their souls so grey and their deeds so small. How can there be anything extraordinary about them? I'll be a homeless outcast forever. But as he was thinking, a red flame caught his eye. In the middle of the dark, dense night, a red flame. He looked around. The flame darted from a high window. Bandits were attacking a rich Jew, bandits with masks on their faces. One was holding a burning torch to light their way. A second one was holding a shiny knife against the rich man's chest and saying, "One move, Jew, and it will be your last. The blade of my knife will come out your back." The rest were opening chests and closets and looting them. The Jew stood there with the knife at his chest and watched calmly. Not a lash twitched over his clear eyes, nor a hair stirred in the white beard that reached down to his loins. Why would he care? The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, he thought. Blessed be the name of the Lord. You're not born with it, and you can't take it with you, his pale lips whispered. And he watched quietly as they opened the last drawer of the last chest and hauled out bags of gold and silver, sacks of jewellery, and all kinds of valuables. And he kept silent. Perhaps he was glad to be rid of them. But all at once, when the robbers reached the last hiding place and yanked out a small bag, the last one, the best concealed, he forgot himself, shuddered, his eyes blazed. He reached out his right hand to stop them and tried to scream, "Don't touch that." But instead of a scream, a red torrent of steaming blood shot out of his mouth. The knife had done its work. It was his heart's blood splashing on the bag. He dropped to the floor, and the bandits tore open the sack. This would be the best, the most valuable. But they were bitterly mistaken. The blood was shed in vain. There was no silver, no gold, no jewellery in the bag, nothing that was precious or had any value in this world. Just a little soil, the earth of Palestine, for his grave. And that was what the rich man wanted to save from thieving hands and eyes and splash with his blood. The soul grabbed a bloody speck of soil from Palestine and took it to the window in heaven. The first gift was accepted. Chapter 3. The second gift. Remember, the angel called out as he closed the window behind the soul. Only 2 more gifts. God will help, thought the soul hopefully, and he cheerfully flew back down. But in the end, his optimism waned. Years and years wore on, and he saw nothing of extraordinary beauty. And again he was haunted by the dismal thought. The world emerged from God's will like a living source and keeps running and running in time, and the further it runs, the more dust and earth it takes in, the muddier and murkier it becomes, the fewer presents one can find in it for heaven, and the smaller the people grow, the pettier the virtues, the tinier the vices, and the good deeds cannot be seen with the naked eyes. If God, he went on to himself, were to weigh the good and bad deeds of the world, the pointer would barely stir, barely quiver. The world cannot go up or down either. It too is a homeless vagabond between radiant heavens and dark abysses, and the defender and the accuser would grapple over it forever, the way light and darkness, heat and cold, life and death grapple on and on. The world balances, but it can't move up and it can't move down, and there will always be marriages and divorces, circumcisions and funerals, festivities and mournings, and love and hate forever and ever. There was a sudden blare of trumpets and horns. He looked down. A German city of long ago, naturally. Slanting roofs edged the square in front of the town hall. The area was filled with people in party-coloured garb. The windows were crowded with heads. People were lying on the roofs, some of them perched astride the wooden beams that stuck out of the walls beneath the roofs, and the balconies were packed. In front of the town hall stood a table covered with green cloth and lined with golden fringe and tassels. The magistrates were sitting there in velvet garments with golden frogs and sable hats with white feathers and diamond buttons. Above them, by himself, sat the presiding magistrate. A gluttonous eagle fluttered over his head. Off to the side, a Jewish girl stood, all bound up. Not far from her, 10 servants held a wild horse. The magistrate rose, turned to the marketplace, and read a verdict from a document. This Jewess, this child of Jews, has committed a grave sin, a sin so grave that even God in his vast mercy could not forgive it. She stole out of the ghetto and went about our pure streets during our sacred holiday. Her shameless eyes sullied our holy procession, our holy images, which we carried through the streets with hymns of praise and a beating of kettle drums. Her accursed ears took in the singing of our innocent white-robed children and the beating of our holy drums. And who can tell whether or not the devil, the filthy devil, who assumed the shape of this Jewess, this daughter of an accursed rabbi? Who can tell whether or not the devil touched and soiled some purity of ours? What did he desire, the devil, in that beauteous shape? For I cannot deny it, she is beautiful, beautiful as only a devil can make himself. Just look at those eyes radiating insolence under the silken lashes that she lowers so chastely. Look at the alabaster face, which has only gotten paler rather than darker during her long imprisonment. Look at her fingers, her long, slender fingers, transparent in the sunshine. And what did he desire, the devil? To tear a soul away from its devotion in our procession, and he succeeded. Look at that beautiful girl, one of our knights exclaimed, a member of one of our most illustrious families. And that was too much. Halberdiers noticed her and seized her, and he didn't even resist that devil. And why? They were pure, absolved of any sin, and so he had no sway over them. And this is the judgment for the devil in the shape of the Jewess. Her hair, her long diabolical braids, shall be bound to the tail of the wild horse. The horse shall gallop away and drag her through the streets like a corpse, the streets that carried her feet against our sacred law. Let her blood bespatter and scour the stones that her feet have defiled. A wild scream of joy tore from all throats, and when the wave of ferocious shouting had washed by, the condemned woman was asked whether she had any final wishes. I do, she replied calmly. I would like some pins. She's crazy with terror, said the magistrates. No, she retorted, cold and placid. That is my last wish and desire. They brought her some pins. And now, commanded the presiding judge, tie her to the horse. Halberdiers strode over, and with trembling hands they tied the long black braids of the rabbi's daughter to the wild horse, which they could barely restrain. Make way, the magistrate shouted to the crowd in the square, and there was an uproar. The people hugged and massed along the house walls, and all of them held up their hands, some clutching a whip, some a rod, others a cloth, all of them ready to egg on the wild horse, their breath bated, their faces ablaze, their eyes flashing. And in the turmoil, no one noticed the condemned woman bend over quietly and fasten the hem of her dress to her legs, sticking the pins deep, deep into the flesh so that her body would not be exposed when the horse dragged her through the streets. It was noticed only by the nameless vagabond, the soul. Release the horse, came the command of the magistrate. The servants leapt back, and the horse tore forward, and a scream whirled from all the mouths, and there was a whirling and a whistling of lashes, rods, and cloths, and the terrified horse dashed across the marketplace, through streets and back alleys, and out of the town. and the soul, the homeless vagabond, had already pulled a bleeding pin out of the condemned woman's leg and was flying up to heaven with it. Just one more gift, the angel at the window comforted him. Chapter 4, the third gift. And down flew the soul again. He needed only one more gift. And more seasons and years wore on, and again he was stricken with melancholy. The world seemed to be getting even smaller, tinier people and tinier actions, both good and evil. Once the soul thought, and if God, praised be his name, should ever stop and judge the world as it is, all at once, and if there should be a defender on one side pouring out the bits and specks from a white sack, and an accuser on the other side pouring out his shreds and pieces, it would take years and years for the sacks to empty. So many trivia. But if the sacks were ever empty, what would happen? The pointer would stay put in the centre with so many trivia, neither side can outbalance the other. And then what? Another tiny feather, a wisp of straw, a speck of chaff, a mote of dust. And what would God do? What would his judgment be? Back to the primal chaos? No. The sins do not outweigh the virtues. Redemption? No again. The virtues do not outweigh the sins. Then what? Keep going, he would say. Keep flying between hell and heaven, love and hatred, tears of pity and smoking blood, between cradles and graves, on and on. But the soul was destined for redemption. A roll of drums aroused him from his brooding. Where was he? When? He couldn't tell the place or time. All he could make out was a square in front of a prison. The rays of the sun played and flashed along the iron bars and the tiny windows. They sparkled on the weapons stacked along the wall. The soldiers held rods in their hands. They stationed themselves in 2 long rows with a narrow passage between them to run someone through the gauntlet. Who? A little Jew with a tattered shirt on his scrawny body, a skull cap on his partly shaven head. Now they led him in. Why was he being punished? Who could say? A matter of olden times. Perhaps a theft, perhaps a robbery or murder. Perhaps he was the victim of a blood libel. Those were olden times. And the soldiers smiled and thought, why did they order so many of us out here? He won't even endure half of it. But now they pushed him into the passageway between the 2 rows. He walked straight and did not stumble and did not fall. He was lashed and he endured it. A fury took hold of the soldiers. He was still walking. And the rods whistled through the air like demons and swished around his body like snakes, and the blood from the scrawny body splashed and splashed and did not stop splashing. All at once, a soldier struck out too high and lashed the skullcap from the victim's head. He only noticed it after a few steps. He stopped, deliberated, made up his mind, and spun around. He would not go bareheaded. He strode back to the skullcap, bent over, straightened out, turned around, and walked on, placid, blood-stained, but with his skullcap on his head, walked until he dropped. And when he dropped, the soul flew over and grabbed the skullcap, which had brought the victim so many unnecessary lashes, and he flew up to the window of heaven. And the third gift was also accepted. And the saints interceded for him. The gates of paradise opened up for the soul after the three gifts. And the oracle, the light and truth, said, "These are really gifts of beauty, extraordinary beauty, but rather useless, not practical, but beautiful, extraordinarily so." That is the end of that story. Trying to work out, is that a long story or a short story, or what happened to this story? I can't tell. Let me have a look. It's a very short one, only 3 pages, 2.5 pages long. Here we go then, babies. The Fool and the Forest Demon, a beginning by Denister. For years on end, the fool lived in the wild forest, serving the forest demon. He chopped his wood, he carried his water, escorted him wherever he went, followed whatever orders he gave. No sooner said than done, smiling and holding his peace. But one day it was summer, the kind of hot and bosky summer day, when there's nothing to do, when everything has been done for the day, and the day is still huge, and the forest is languorous from the sun itself and the day, and from standing. And the forest demon felt null and void, and wearily and summerly, and in the bright daylight he climbed into his ancient linden tree to rest. It was the time of day when sunny shadows crouch by trees that stand in the forest, that lies with quiet birds and nests that are quieter still. On such a day, the fool would go off to his faraway, known only to him place, the quiet place, hidden behind low trees and dense leaves. There was an old stone there, covered with moss. And the fool would come and sit down next to it, with his back to the stone and his face to where he had come from. And for the rest of the day he remained lost in his own and in bosky thoughts. all alone in this place, with the day's peace upon his head and with no one about, he would sit there, and sometimes a smile would command his face and come to his lips, a clear smile and a joyous one, a pure smile from his inmost being, and he would beam and radiate, by himself and to himself, fine and more than fine, and thus, joyously, he would remain in his fine and foolish mood for a long, long while. At dusk, however, when the sun was setting, when shadows were creeping forth all around, settling on the forest and on the trees, the fool would get up, would turn to the stone, would stand before it for a long time, staring at it, and then say to it before he left, "I've sat near you all day long, stone, believed in you all day long, thought, like all the other times, that today at last you would open by sunset and pull a sun out of yourself and give it to the evening and make night impossible. I was hoping for it today, and more than once it seemed to me as though the power were coursing through you to open you at last, and inside myself I laughed aloud. But now I've got to double back and serve the forest and the demon again, and keep waiting for you, stone, and I, the fool, have to leave." And the fool would turn and leave the stone in its hiding place and thicket, alone in the woods, and return with dusk and sunset, and softly and late in the evening, in the darkness, come back to the forest demon and his linden tree, and find him lying there and sleeping. "What time is it?" After a while, from the trunk of the tree, a husky voice would emerge. "It's late and time to get up." The demon would first stick out his head and horns, and then crawl out with bones and skin, and stretch and yawn, and crack his bones, and lean on the fool's shoulder, and the fool would hold him up, his body and his heaviness, until the demon felt demonic and refreshed. Then he started looking about, nocturnal and cheerful, as to where and on what side he would do something at night, where and what was in store for him tonight. He thought and thought it out. He would at last, with a commanding forefinger, order the fool to get the pots together for supper. He went along with him, and off they went, off to the side. That's how it was. That's how it went for years and years on end. And the demon was master, the fool was his servant, and changes were none. But then, one day, after an afternoon of sleeping and an evening of getting up, the demon and the fool went off into the deepest woods. That night, a summerly and moonly one, a clear and radiant night. They were walking and walking till at last they arrived at some kind of midpoint. And there they saw that they had never been in this place before, that they had never noticed a place so overgrown with grass below, so overshadowed by trees above, and never so wild, and never so strange, never so dusky, and never so bright. Long, gigantic trees were standing in their tallness and fullness, their trunks alive with healthy saps, their roots in earthly security, the tops in brightness, and the branches at their heads, and never noticing, in their might and their height, the demon and the fool at their roots. Tiny and trivial, the two of them moved about the trunks, their heads tilted up and away, gaping at the treetops, unable to remove their eyes or cease their wonder. Where are we? I don't know, the fool replied. I don't recognize these woods. And then the demon gave the fool an order. He was to unpack their things and build a fire. They had to spend the night. They had to reconnoitre. The fool obeyed. He quickly built a fire in the grass and put on the evening meal and started cooking it. He sat there staring at the fire, and from time to time he added fuel to keep it going, and it flared and flamed. While the fool was staring at the fire, the demon was wandering about and away, reconnoitring the place, and still not leaving, and then staying by the fire. But then, when the smoke was storming the sky, the demon came over to the fool and said to him, "Fool, I am leaving you alone to sit by the fire and keep it going and to keep yourself awake. Just let the smoke keep rising. I'm leaving you now. I have to leave and get to know this place. It's not good for a demon whose words are his province to find a place he doesn't know." No sooner said than gone. The fool remained alone at the fire. He sat in silence, and as was his wont in woods and grass in the forest light, he was lost in thought. And he softly laughed for long and longer, like the simpleton he was, quietly and joyously, as was his way. But, having laughed his fill to himself, and for his pleasure, he turned back to the fire quietly, and with his final smile he built it up. The smoke rose higher and higher up the trees, straight in smoky columns, so still and so long, so dusky and unperceived, till the dusk had fully deepened and midnight came along, and the demon didn't come, and the fool felt like sleeping, and he started drowsing off and moved closer to the fire, and he cuddled up and, sitting there, his head upon his chest, losing it and dropping off. And just as the fool was falling asleep down below, up above in a high, strong tree at the very top, a branch began to sway. A young woman, a forest creature, appeared in the tree and started staring down at the fool asleep by his fire. She stared and she swayed, and sylph-like, sylvan and barely visible, she kept swaying up and down until her swaying stopped, and she stopped the branch with her body, and weightless and breathless, and after staring and staring, she finally shouted down, "Fool, why are you sleeping? I come from the stone. The stone's not alone. The stone has split open." shouted and waited for the fool and his awakening. No use. So she shouted down again, "Why are you sleeping, fool? This is your final night for serving the demon. Go, they're waiting at the stone. They're watching out for you." And still the fool would not awake. So she took a huge, dry, hard nut and aimed it straight and true and hit the fool, donk, right on his sleepy head. "Get up!" And as the fool awoke, he found the demon, who had come back and was standing before him, his head tilted up and turned aloft, gazing and staring at the top of the nearby tree, surprised and asking upward, "Who's there?" "Me," came the answer back down. "Who's me?" "The forest creature." "What do you want?" "I want to redeem the master from bondage." "Who do you mean?" "Him," she pointed down at the fool. And when the demon turned to look him in the face, he found him, as was his wont and his way, with his head bowing down to the ground, stooping and standing ashamed, quiet and good-natured and smiling, embarrassed and abashed, as though guilty of something. The demon gave him a more serious stare, awoke him and harassed him in his shame-faced standing. "Who, fool?" "Yes," the fool replied, raising his head and barely looking him in the eyes. "We are going our separate ways." And the demon held his tongue. And the fool gave the demon his evening food. He stood alone and aloof, like a servant, waiting for the demon to finish eating. Then he put the dishes and silver away, and quietly and together with the demon, he left that place, and he left that night to go back, to go home. And when they arrived, the fool went over to the tree, and quietly, after the quiet events, he stood and faced him, holding his tongue and standing at the trunk. And then he knelt down with his face to the ground and lay before him, still and long. Knelt and stooped so long and before his tree-filled earth until he stood up before him and his property, and went over to the demon and looked in his eyes. And then he tersely said to him, "The fool is grateful to you." "For what?" "For all these long and many years, for my being here and my having been, and waiting for nothing, no speech and no words." He turned around and he turned away from the demon and from serving the demon, and left his place and his tree forever. This is a slightly longer tale by I.J. Trunk. The Jewish Pope, a historical tale. Chapter 1. Let us go to the bookshelves and open the old parchments. Our sages have said, Jewish troubles are as lasting as the world, and they knew what they were saying. Today, we Jews are still living in a dreadful world. Israel is a scattered flock, said Jeremiah, specks of dust in a hurricane. And even now, the world is bringing us no end of hardship. Today's Jews are not the only ones to have suffered in our history. Nothing is new for us. Thus, from time to time, it doesn't hurt to go to our old bookcases and open the dusty parchments, to have a look at bygones, to see how our grandfathers and grandmothers lived long ago. We leaf through these bygones, and what do we see? Old wine in new pouches. Scholars try to persuade us that time is a carriage drawn by fiery steeds, galloping headlong, and the world sits in this carriage like an aristocrat and drives on. But believe me, my dear readers, that's nothing but a fairy tale. In reality, we are stuck knee-deep in the mud of the dawn of creation. We merely dream that we are dashing along in a carriage. At times, Jews aren't even allowed to dream that they are driving in a carriage. Jews are still caught in the mud of the world at the very outset of existence. And so, dear readers, let us look at an eternal present at which all clocks have stopped. Let us turn back several centuries and see how Jews once lived and worked in such a renowned city as Frankfurt on the Main. Chapter 2. Jews and Christians in Frankfurt on the Main. In those days, Frankfurt was one of the richest cities in Germany, a city of prince-electors, bishops and patricians. The austere and colourful plenty of the Christian Middle Ages was poured out on its houses and districts, on the behaviour and dress of its Christian inhabitants. It was the stiff and stern splendour of medieval wilderness. Off to the side of this imperial and episcopal city lay the Jewish ghetto, like an enclosed and secluded darkness. Not even the sun was permitted to give its radiance to the Jews, or the air to blow its freshness here. The alleys of the ghetto were narrow and dingy, the houses poor and shabby. They couldn't expand on the ground, so they stretched and grew upward, consumptive and bloodless. The new generations of Jews had to squeeze into these dark, close cages, one generation atop another. No expansion was allowed. The Christians kept the area of the ghetto bound off like an abomination. And even this miserable abomination had been thrown to the Jews by the citizens of Frankfurt like alms to a beggar. You Jews can live and die right here, but not a step farther. Yet the ghetto hummed like a beehive. During the 6 work days of the week, a stranger at first sight would have been flabbergasted. What was all the commotion about? What was all the hustle and bustle in this cramped darkness? He would have thought he had come to a place of the worst paupers and beggars. The men in rags and tatters. The women were shrouded in poverty. Why, then, were the Jews hurrying and scurrying? Eventually the stranger would have realised that business was buzzing in these ruins of existence. Jews dealt in old clothes. You could see the expensive nightly garments which, worn outside in the Christian Frankfurt on the Main had shone at balls and palaces in the light and incense of Catholic churches and cathedrals, and now, perhaps it was the way of the past, they lay in heaps throughout the darknesses of the Jewish ghetto. And Jews drove their trade with these Gentile bygones. Oh, sorry, I just got a stabbing pain in the side of my eye. Made a good living. Oh, there it goes again. Jews also did business with valuables, with gold, silver, and precious stones, and their coffers held golden ducats. Ducats? Ducats. Yeah, ducats, sorry. The nobles and patricians of Frankfurt came into the Jewish darknesses to buy and sell, and to borrow the golden ducats that lay in the Jewish coffers. Next to the Jews who did commerce with gold in the confinements of the ghetto, there were also Jews who dealt in the gold and gems of the highest worlds, Jews who were Talmudists, Kabbalists, scholars. The Jewish ghetto was small and close, and so everything fused into one. Worldly talk and spiritual dialogue were coupled like the harmonies of some dark, profound symphony of the world. The Jews could show no strength like that of their Christian neighbours outside the walls of the ghetto. Thou worm, Jacob! Jews were weak from the eternal darkness and old from the eternal burden. Even the weapons they had in the ghetto were junk, good only for hawking and not for war. But their age-old experience teaches Jews how to use everything as a parable. The whole world is nothing but a parable. In the bottomless depths, one can play with clouds. And so they knew how to use the tune of trumpets in the fighting of armies. Now their wars had no bloodshed, God forbid. Their troops were wooden figures. And with these armies they fought many battles with the nobles and patricians of Frankfurt on the Main. The powerful Gentiles were often beaten on the battlefield and suffered defeat at the hands of the Jews. It was the battlefield of chess. The human soul is like a flowing river. When the current is obstructed along one bank, it overflows on the other bank, and its force is greater there. The accounts of human desires have to be balanced somewhere, and substance and spirit are on the same level here. Man, who by nature cannot renounce anything, merely changes his field of action and desire. Whatever he loses in substance, he tries to make up for in spirit, and vice versa, unfortunately. The good spirit and the evil spirit are most likely one and the same angel. An angel who acts in Purim skits, a rascal and a rogue, who merely dons a cape in which we wish to see him. And the Jews enclosed in the ghetto of Frankfurt on the Main would in no wise forego anything that their powerful neighbours and oppressors enjoyed outside the walls. They merely pursued it in other worlds. They drew the pleasures and fantasies of this life from the Talmud, the Kabbalah, and from other sacred books. Nor did they wish to do without wars and knightly jousts, and they absolutely wanted to fight a great battle with their powerful neighbours. The chessboard was the only battlefield on which the ghetto Jews were transformed into knights in armour. For all their hatred and scorn of the Jews in the cramped ghetto, the Gentiles of Frankfurt on the Main could never cease to admire their mastery at chess. These men without rights showed genius and sharp reasoning in their strategies with the wooden figures. Patricians, priests, and bishops would often summon the Jews to their palaces to lock horns in a quiet, intricate war and to suffer defeat and downfall. The Jews kept buying and selling in the palaces, lending golden ducats, taking collateral, doing a generous business. Chapter 3. Simon Barban and his renown. In those days of long ago, there lived in the ghetto of Frankfurt a Jew named Simon Barban. He was a great teacher, a Kabbalist, and a sharp scholar, a fine figure of a man, tall and with a beautiful, long beard. His Judaism shone like a good name. He was a God-fearing Jew, endowed with all the virtues. He not only devoted himself to religious studies, but also to doing good deeds and helping his fellow Jews. His business was old coins, valuable ones, and through this trade he came into contact with the foremost men and nobles in Frankfurt on the Main. But his wide renown among Christians was mainly due to his skill and acumen in the ways of chess figures. Whenever Simon Barban sat down to a game of chess, he looked as if his mind were crackling and sparkling with sharp, hidden bolts of light. Offhand, it might have seemed as if the amazing thing about this Jew was his embodiment of that Talmudic sentence about the union of learning and wealth. What more could a Jew desire than a good name and all his accomplishments? His measure of honour became full when the elders of the community came and asked him to be rabbi of the Frankfurt ghetto. Simon said no to the elders. When I play chess with the Gentile nobles and beat them, I can request more favours for Jews than if I were to sit on the rabbinical throne. Chapter 4. Shabbat's coming. There's a kookaburra laughing. It's a beautiful evening. I'll show you the skyline. Beautiful colour of indigo. And the sun is just about to go down. And I'm waiting to see 3 stars in the sky. I still haven't bought Shabbat candles. I have to buy them from Golds in Sydney, and they're quite expensive. I'm annoyed about that, but it's the way of the world, is it not? They last a long time that's why they're expensive, because I'll buy 72 and they'll last for quite a while. But I kind of feel a hypocrite lighting the candles when I go dancing on the Friday night as well, amongst the Gentiles, the non-Jews, and haven't set foot in a synagogue or a temple in years, so kind of, what's the point in even bothering to light the candles, am I right? It's kind of, I feel kind of torn, but I had spirit earlier when I was reading saying to me, you go out tonight, someone wants you there. And I don't like being pressured even by the spirits because, free will's a thing, people, and I'm wild and I'm free and I do my own thing and I do what I want, whatever, am I right? But Ramjet are playing tonight, so I like to support Ramjet as well as Alter Egos. They've been lovely to me and I like their music. So I'll think about it. I'm very tired today. You wouldn't know by all this reading, but I'm actually quite weary. So I may not go tonight. I may give it a rest. But I've got an energy behind me that's kind of pressuring me to go. And because they're pressuring me, now I don't want to go. See? Even the angels have to be careful how they give me direct orders because it can really make me do the opposite. And sometimes I'm meant to be there when they're pressuring me. There's a higher reason for it, so who knows? It's been a lot of stress the last few Friday nights with weird things, weird kind of, not exactly physical attacks like I've had in the past, but just weirdness, So I'm kind of tired. It wouldn't hurt to have a break, I think. I'll see. The night is still young. I usually decide around about between 8 and 9 p.m. if I'm definitely going, and then on goes the makeup and I get dressed and off I go. If I do go tonight, I'm thinking about taking the bus because it's costing a lot with car parking at the Maya Centre and I still have the long walk. So if I'm going to walk anyway, I might as well take the bus, save a bit of money, am I right? And yeah, I'm thinking about that too, quite seriously. I bought a ticket to go to the 10th birthday celebrations on the 19th of October. I think I'll definitely take a bus that day because it's going to be a long day of festivities and car parking will be a massive problem. So, yes, I'll take the bus that day. Right, where were we? Chapter 4. He shall not flourish with the Jewish trees. There is a shadow behind every light. The sun has spots. Perfection is to be found only in the Maker and not in a mortal. A human being is only dust and ashes. His days are a passing shadow, like the instants that flash by us. To make a long story short, Simon, may all Jews be spared the like, was childless. Let us again take up the parable of the stranger entering the ghetto of Frankfurt on the Main. He would have seen the confinement, the darknesses. He would have seen the shabby Jews walking about like wan shadows. The stranger might even have thought to himself, these poor Jews in this prison of darkness, why are they so eager to have children, and even more children? They won't be allowed any room to spread out in. Why do they need so many offspring for this confinement? New generations for Jewish misery? Isn't it a stubborn madness to call forth new Jewish generations for the future? It is a stubborn madness. It's also a biological imperative of all humans across all nations on earth. Continue to have your children. Life, l'chaim. Don't get turned into cyborgs. Don't be sterilized. Live your best life, no matter what, no matter who. If the stranger had only been a keen observer and managed to find his bearings in the darkness of worldly thought. He might have realised that what he saw in the ghetto wasn't all there was to know about Jews. It was dark here, to be sure, but dark like the twilight before a new radiance about to reach out across the world. And it is this coming light for which Jews prepare their generations. A Jew without offspring is like a tree that shall not bloom when a new springtime comes over the world. He shall not flourish with the Jewish trees. That was the great sadness in the life of Simon Bar-Bun, supposedly the happiest Jew in the ghetto of Frankfurt on the Main. Chapter 5. A dream in 3 parts. It was a minor Day of Atonement, the fast observed by Jews on the eve of the new moon. Simon Bar-Bun was in the 35th year of his life. Coming home from synagogue, he couldn't understand why he was wearier than he had ever been after a fast. He could barely keep his eyes open. Simon Bar-Bun had a bite, but he was so racked with fatigue that he ate very little and went to bed. No sooner did his head touch the pillow than he fell asleep. He dreamt that his wife Glikel had given birth to a boy, and he was celebrating the circumcision. In the twinkling of an eye, Simon Bar-Bun in his sleep was amazed at how the years flashed by like instants in a dream. It was 13 years later. He was already celebrating his son's bar mitzvah. His son was renowned as a prodigy. Any Jewish mother would desire such a son. His joy woke Simon out of his sleep. His eyes opened. The room was dark. Off in a corner, a tiny candle stub was flickering in a night lamp. Simon Bar-Bun fell asleep again, and again he had a dream. In the dream, he heard the pealing of many bells. He was in a large square. The sun was shining. His son, a handsome young man in his 20s, was standing at the centre of the square. He had a strange pointed crown of gold on his head. The crown was sparkling in the sunshine. The square was crowded with thousands and thousands of people. They were all kneeling before his son in the golden crown. Simon Bar-Bun wanted to walk up and ask his son, "Who are these people, and why all this ringing and kneeling?" But Simon was driven away with cracking whips. He was so dismayed at being driven away from his own son that he began weeping piteously in his sleep. The sobbing woke him up. His eyes opened, and behold, it was a dream. The room was dark. The tiny candle stub flickered in the night lamp. He fell asleep again, and again he dreamt. His son was dressed like a Jewish pauper. He had ashes on his head, sackcloth on his loins. He was sitting on the ground next to a glowing stick of wood, and his broken voice was reciting the 102nd Psalm, the prayer of an afflicted man who poured out his woe to God. Terror-stricken, Simon Bar-Bun woke up from his sleep. The room was dark. In the corner, the tiny candle stub was flickering in the night lamp. Chapter 6. The first part of the dream comes true. The world says, a dream is a fool. Who believes a fool? Simon Baboon tried to forget his dream, which was so peculiar, so joyous, so mournful, and slowly it slipped out of his mind. But it often happens that a fool speaks the deepest wisdom, and a dream reveals the greatest truth. Before 3 months were up, Simon Baboon's wife Glickle announced the glad tiding, "Husband, I am with child." Simon trembled with joy. The dream suddenly emerged from oblivion. He saw all 3 scenes, clear and sharp before his eyes. He shuddered at the 3 parts of the dream that an unknown hand had written on the darkness of night, like a Menetekel. Menetekel? It's probably Yiddish, but I don't know that word. Menetekel. Tekel is... no, something else. Menetekel. Menetekel. Anyway, bear with me, babies. He was joyous, hopeful, saddened. The 9 months of pregnancy flew by. Glickle, actually let me write that word down because I'll put it in the description because it'll bug me not knowing what that word is and what it means until I do something about it. Am I right? There was a word earlier I didn't know either. Bosky, B-O-S-K-Y. Got to look that up too. It kind of didn't comment too much on it, but this one's so far out of left field, I need to know. I won't rest till I know, babies. Knowledge is power. Right, we'll keep the pen and thing out just in case we need to find out what other words mean. The 9 months of pregnancy flew by. Glickle gave birth to a boy who simply filled the cradle with light. Again the months flew by. They saw the boy growing, a delight for any Jewish mother's heart, beautiful and intelligent. He was the talk of the ghetto of Frankfurt. At 3, like all little Jewish boys, he started attending the Helyder, which is also strange because I know it as cheder, but we'll work with it. We'll write that down too. I know they mean cheder, but I've never heard of Helyder before. Must be a dialect from where they came. The traditional Jewish school. Cheder, should be cheder. Why did they put an L in it? The teacher was beside him with admiration for the sharp little mind. He said the boy would grow up to be a great man in Israel. When he was 13, they couldn't find any more teachers for him. He outshone them all. At his bar mitzvah, he received a rabbinical certificate from the greatest rabbis in France and Germany. The wealthiest Jews throughout the world sent marriage brokers to Simon Baboon. They showered him with gold, trying to get that rare prodigy, Joseph Baboon, for his son-in-law. Simon Bar-Bun was the envy of all Jews, but his heart was filled with trembling and sinister expectations. The first part of the dream has come true, he thought to himself. Who can say whether the other two parts will not come true? God forbid. At night, when no one was listening, he opened a window, looked up at the stars. His lips softly whispered the 102nd Psalm, the prayer of an afflicted man. Chapter 7. Joseph Bar-Bun goes to bathe in the mine. Our wise men have said, between heaven and hell there is only a thin partition, as fine as a hair. This fine partition also stands between fortune and misfortune. It stands between our good and our bad deeds. It stands between our hopes and blights. Most likely, it also stands between death and life. It was a day of rejoicing in Simon Bar-Bun's home. A wealthy Jew, a prince in Israel, who was also a great scholar, a certain Don Menachem from the city of Orleans in France, was supposed to visit Frankfurt on the Main and see the famous prodigy Joseph Bar-Bun. He would talk to him and study with him and then draw up a contract of betrothal between him and his only daughter Hetaerae, an unusually learned and beautiful girl who had no peer in all the world. The joy was boundless. Simon even forgot the dream that always gnawed at his heart. It was the middle of summer. The great Don Menachem was expected at dawn, God willing. The ghetto was stifling. The young prodigy Joseph asked his parents if he could go outside the city to bathe in the river Main, naturally at a place where Jews were allowed to bathe. Because of the foul heat in the ghetto, the parents gave him permission. They sent along a servant to guard him. Chapter 8. Joseph has been torn to shreds. Simon Bar-Bun battles with the winds. That was in the morning. It was noon. It was evening. The sun was setting over Frankfurt on the Main. Joseph Bar-Bun and the servant still weren't back. It was night. The weeping of Simon Bar-Bun and his wife Glickle filled the ghetto. The men sighed along. The women wept along. Others tried to comfort them. Perhaps they had just gotten lost. Perhaps the gates of the ghetto had been closed and Joseph and the servant had to spend the night out. And it was dawn. All words of solace turned out to be false. They hunted wherever Jews might hunt. Simon Bar-Bun hired Christian fishermen. They sailed their skiffs across the Main and cast their nets into the deep. Perhaps God would take pity. Perhaps they might still find some trace of the lost boy. But no voice and no answer. The river kept its silence. A month later, a travelling beggar found Joseph's hat on the bank of the Main. The hat was full of sand. Simon Bar-Bun grabbed the hat with both hands. In great dread he shouted, "Joseph has been torn to shreds. Joseph is dead. My eyes will never see him again." "Oh, you dreams," he shrieked. "You're all a pack of lies, whether you're happy or whether you're sad." Simon Bar-Bun and his wife Glickle sat down for the 7 days of mourning. All the Jews in the ghetto came to comfort him. The tragedy reached the ears of the nobles in Frankfurt, the Gentiles who did business with Simon and played chess with him. Some of them felt the stirrings of of pity. They thought to themselves, in unhappiness, all people are alike, both Christians and Jews. Fate makes no distinctions. No, it does not. And the nobles of Frankfurt came to Simon's home, spoke words of comfort to him. But how could human beings comfort him if the years could not? Even time could not close the wound, though it is in the nature of time to heal all pains. Glickel went blind from her constant weeping. She went about groping the air, calling, "Joseph!" Simon hunched together and became as grey as a pigeon. He stopped plying his trade. He no longer had a mind for valuables and old coins. Reluctantly, he became rabbi of the ghetto in Frankfurt on the Main. He renounced all the worldly delights that a Jew is allowed to enjoy. In his grief, he no longer felt the least pleasure in bodily desires. There was only one thing he wouldn't give up: chess. When he sat down at the chessboard, his sharp mind soon blazed in a war between the wooden figures. Simon played with passion, pleasure. He wanted to fight, and he did fight. Against whom? The winds or destiny? Chapter 9. 23 years have flown by. 23 years flew by. In the ghetto of Frankfurt on the Main, the Jews were preparing for Passover. They were cleaning and scrubbing in the Jewish darknesses. They were baking matzot. Rabbi Simon Barbun went from house to house with a large handkerchief, collecting money for poor Jews who didn't have enough for the holidays. A few days before Passover, he received a visit from Zalman Ziskant, the head of the community elders. His eyes were red with weeping. In a broken voice, he informed the rabbi of a bitter tiding. Chapter 10. Zalkant, the synagogue crier, beats his drum in the streets. The Jews fast. "Rabbi," said Zalman Ziskant, the community elder, "a time of trouble has come upon the Jews. This morning I received an order from the electoral bishop. Within 6 weeks, all Jews must leave the Frankfurt ghetto. If we stay even a day longer, they will strip us to our skins, and the electors Landsknechts will drive us out with hounds and whips." I guess kind of lieutenants, but I'll have to look that up later too. "The Christians have been quiet for a long time," said Rabbi Simon with a deep and bitter sigh. "You'll have to make the effort," said Zalman Ziskant, "of personally going to the electoral bishop. Pardon me. He always had a great deal of respect for you, Rabbi. When you were young, you played no end of chess with him. We've always thought of him as a fine nobleman and a friend of the Jews. His heart must have suddenly spun around. Such an awful decree Simon couldn't stop sighing. The way I remember the bishop, he was a good and pious Christian. Perhaps, Zalmanziskind, Simon suddenly cried out to the community elder. Perhaps a fellow Jew has committed some sin against the ruler, God forbid, or perhaps he deceived one of the noblemen and gave him counterfeit money. You know how it is, Zalmanziskind, when Gentiles say Jew, they soon mean all Jews. I would offer the following advice, Simon went on. Zalkind, the synagogue crier, should immediately take the community drum, go through the streets and declare, under pain of ban, that whoever has done any wrong to the nobles should come to synagogue for afternoon prayers and speak the truth. And like Jacob and Esau, we shall become friends anew. The truth might help to soften the hearts of the rich Gentiles outside. And thus it was, Zalkind, the synagogue crier, went about through the ghetto and beat his drum and called out the decree of the court of justice. Afternoon prayers in synagogue, no one confessed to even the slightest peccadillo. Rabbi Simon ordered the Jews to fast the next day and pray for forgiveness. He himself put on the pointed Jewish hat, took the staff with the silver knob, and went off to the palace of the electoral bishop. Chapter 11. The electoral bishop. When Rabbi Simon came to the episcopal palace, he was received very cordially. The bishop had him ushered into his cabinet. He even walked over to welcome Rabbi Simon, held out his hands to him, inquired after his health. Your Eminence, said Rabbi Simon in a gloomy voice, has any Jew offended or, God forbid, deceived a Christian? One man has sinned, and you intend to pour out your wrath on a whole community. The rabbi quoted this biblical verse to the bishop, but in pure church Latin. God forbid, Rabbi, said the bishop, trembling. None of you has done anything whatsoever to me. My heart bleeds at the thought of treating you with such cruelty. It is also a loss to the city of Frankfurt. We have had a large revenue from the Jews. You have enriched the city with your trade and commerce. But what can I do? The expulsion decree has come from the hands of the Pope in Rome. His Holiness has issued the order himself. I would advise you to go to Rome personally, fall on your knees before the Holy Father and beg him to rescind this bitter decree. I know your good heart, Your Eminence, said Simon, but how can a Jew reach the papal throne all by himself? Could you possibly give me a letter that would open the doors of the Vatican and let me come to the feet of His Holiness? I would be honoured to do so, said the bishop happily. Not only will I give you a letter, but I'll also write to the Vatican that you are a great chess player. The Holy Father loves to play chess. Believe me, Rabbi, at the chessboard you will have a much greater influence in getting His Holiness to rescind the decree. The bishop wrote a long letter to the Pope in Rome and handed the letter to Rabbi Simon. Simon Barbun thanked the bishop on behalf of all the Jews in the ghetto of Frankfurt. When he stood up from the chair and was about to take his leave, the bishop held Rabbi Simon's hands for a long time and suddenly asked him whether he had ever heard any news about his lost son. Rabbi Simon Barbun heaved a deep sigh. We never can tell, Rabbi, said the bishop, holding Simon's hands. The world is huge in its expanse and wondrous in its occurrences. One should never despair, never stop hoping. Simon Bar-Bun lowered his head. He thought to himself, what do the Gentiles know about faith? Chapter 12. Simon Bar-Bun and the 3 elders set out for Rome. As soon as Simon Bar-Bun came back to the ghetto, he called together the community elders for a meeting. He told them about his conversation with the bishop. They absolutely had to go to Rome immediately and petition the Holy Pontiff himself. And 3 of the community elders would have to accompany Rabbi Simon. Let it look like a delegation from the Jews of Frankfurt. That is what Jews have always done whenever they went to plead with the mighty of the world to rescind a terrible edict. They drew up a precise account of the expenses. The journey would cost them more than 1,000 thalers. Several rich Jews in the ghetto together contributed the 1,000 thalers. Rabbi Simon Bar-Bun proclaimed a general fast. On the evening of the fast, before the Torah was read in the great synagogue, Rabbi Simon gave a long sermon. Both the men's and the women's sections were packed, a crowded mass of Jews. The huge candles were melting. The rabbi spoke words of reproof. The men wept. The sobbing of women could be heard from the balcony. The day after the fast, Rabbi Simon and 3 of the community elders set out on the long journey to the Vatican in Rome. Chapter 13. They travel through the Jewish communities. The journey from Frankfurt on the Main to Rome took many weeks. The Jewish communities through which Rabbi Simon and the 3 elders passed were all a-tremble. Jews everywhere had heard about the terrible papal decree expelling the holy community of Frankfurt on the Main. The Jews were sighing. The rabbi and the 3 elders were received with great reverence in all the ghettos. In their honour, the Jews recited psalms and liturgies in synagogues, so that the good Lord would take pity on the children of Israel in Frankfurt on the Main. And thus, travelling through the many communities, the 4 Jews at last arrived at the gates of Rome. Chapter 14. 4 Jews in pointed Jewish hats on the streets of Rome. When a Jew sees a cross, he knows what's in store for him. When the 4 Frankfurt Jews walked through the streets of Rome, they were filled with dread. Rome looked like an everlasting Holy Thursday. It was right after Easter. The warm blue heavens resounded with prayers. The streets were dark with the cassocks of thousands of priests. Amid the black cassocks were the burning scarlet gowns of cardinals. Barefoot monks walked by. Their heads were shaven. Their loins girded with rope. There were processions everywhere. The people were carrying holy images of gold and marble, babbling prayers. Amid the bustle of cassocks and processions, they could see rich carriages. Inside them sat great beauties dressed in splendour and luxury. Later, the elders of Frankfurt discovered that the beautiful women in the carriages were well-known Roman courtesans and Hetaerae. I'm assuming prostitutes. Hetaerae. Many of them were the mistresses of high